Hello and welcome back to the PSD to HTML flat design build. Now that we've finished with our header, we're going to move on to our feature slider here. And as I've mentioned before, we're not going to actually completely build this slider out as far as the functionality of it is concerned. We're just going to worry about the design of it. So we've already created the HTML structure that we need for this particular slider. Now we just need to style it and get everything in place. Because right now, if we were to look at it in our browser, it's just a mess right now. So we have some items that we can't even see yet, and everything else is just kind of laid out on the screen, and we need to fix that, obviously. So I want to start in this lesson, if we go back to our Photoshop file, by styling the navigation items here. So we have the left and right arrows that will take us to the next and previous slides, and we see that they're hovering over the edge or the boundary of that feature slider a little bit. And then we have these four navigation items down here at the bottom, which give us an indicator of which slide we're on. And we should be able to click on any of those items to take us to the corresponding slide. So if you remember, if we go back to our HTML, and I've moved everything into a new folder, so all the changes we make in this lesson will be saved in the Site 15 folder. But if we come down below our header, which we just finished, we'll find our main content section. And just inside that main content section is our feature slider, and that's contained in a div with a class of feature slider. So just inside that opening div tag, we have two anchor tags here with a class of nav left and nav right. These are going to be the left and right arrows that you can click on to take you to the previous and next slides. And then just below those, we have an unordered list with a class of slider nav, which has four list items in it. Those are going to be the four navigation dots down at the bottom left corner. So the HTML for these navigation items is just listed in line. So we have a couple of links and then an unordered list. And what we want to do is we want to style them, obviously, but we also want to position them where they need to be within that featured slider. And we're going to do that using absolute positioning on these elements. And remember, if we want to absolutely position these items within that feature slider, then we also need to give our feature slider class, which is the parent of those items, we need to give that feature slider class a position of relative. Now, if we look in our main.css file, if you remember in an earlier video, we've already created a rule for the feature slider class, and we gave it a background color of white. The next thing I want to do here is to go ahead and give it a position of relative. Also, I already know how tall this feature slider is going to be because I've measured it in Photoshop, and it's going to be 320 pixels tall. So let's go ahead and set the height here for that feature slider to 320 pixels. And that gets us where we need to be for the feature slider. Now this isn't going to change anything as far as the appearance of the page goes right now. If we refresh it, as we can see, the only thing that really changes is the height. Everything else still kind of looks the same. So now we need to go in and style and position our navigation items. So let's jump back into our code and let's go ahead and comment off this section so that we can navigate to our slider section easily. So we'll just use a comment line there that denotes this particular section as being for the slider. And we're going to focus now on, if we go back to our Photoshop file, the left and right or the previous and next buttons for our slider. Now right now, all we have in our markup for these two items is an empty link tag. So we have an empty link tag for the one on the left and an empty link tag for the one on the right. There's not even an image inside that empty link tag. And we're going to pull that image in as a background image for that link tag. And then we'll set the width and height and position everything. So the left and right arrows here are both 53 pixels wide by 53 pixels tall. That's the size of the images that we saved for the left and right arrows. And remember, if we want to position them within this feature slider, we need to give them a position of absolute. So there's a couple of things we can do to both of these nav left and nav right items that are going to be similar. So we can go ahead and create a rule for both of those classes together. And again, if we go to our HTML first, we can see that we gave those anchor tags a class of nav left and nav right. So let's jump back to our CSS and make a rule for that. So we'll skip a couple lines after our feature slider rule and create a rule for nav-left, comma space, dot nav-right. So again, there's a few things we can do to both of those classes. First of all, we're going to set the position of these to absolute. Then we're going to set the width and height to 53 pixels each. So the width is 53 pixels and the height is 53 pixels. And then we can also apply a top position to both of these because they're going to have the same top position. They're going to have a different left and right position, but they're going to have the same top position. And all that means, if we go back to our Photoshop file, is that they're at the same distance from the top of that feature slider area. And the distance that I've calculated for that is 131 pixels from the top edge of that feature slider. So let's go back to our code and we'll give our nav left and nav right classes a top position of 131 pixels. So let's save that and see how it looks so far. We'll save our CSS file and we'll go back to our browser. And again, make sure that you're pointing to site15/index.html since we are in the site 15 folder now, And then we'll refresh our page. And we don't see anything yet, and that's because we haven't given those items a background color, so they really don't have an appearance yet, or a background image, I'm sorry. So let's go back to our file. And again, even though we've given them a width and height and a position of absolute, they still have no appearance because there's nothing inside that anchor tag. So let's point to each one individually so that we can give them the right image. So first we'll make a rule for nav-left. And inside that rule, we're going to point to the background property. And we're going to use a URL to do this. So inside parentheses and inside single quotes, I'm going to type /img for the images folder, and then the name of the previous button or the left slider navigation is called slider-left.png. We're going to set its position to top left, and we're going to set it to no repeat. Then I'm going to copy that nav left rule, skip a couple lines and paste it, and we'll just change left to right, and we'll change it here as well. So let's save that, jump back into our browser and refresh, and now we can actually see the buttons, and now we see that we get the hand cursor whenever we hover over it, notifying us that it is a link and we can click on it. And now we just need to position the left and right values for these two items. We've already positioned the top value whenever we created the rule for both of those classes, but now inside nav left and nav right, we're going to set the left and right properties. So inside the nav left class, we're going to set the left value to -10 pixels. Remember, in our Photoshop file, those buttons overlap the left edge of our feature slider. And the way we do that is by giving it a negative value. So we're going to set it 10 pixels to the left of that left boundary. So let's go back to our code and we'll jump down to the nav right section. And after the background there, we're going to set the right property to -10 pixels. And that will make it overlap the right edge of the feature slider. So let's save our code, jump back into our browser and refresh our page. And there we go. We have our left and right arrows where they need to be. So now all that's left for our navigation is our unordered list. And that unordered list is representing these 4 dots down here in the bottom left-hand corner of our slider. So let's go back to our code and let's first of all look at our HTML and remember that it's in an unordered list with a class of slider nav. So right now in our browser, all we're seeing of that slider nav unordered list are the 4 list items or the bullet points for those 4 list items. There's no content in those list items yet. If we go back to our HTML, we can see that it has an anchor tag in it, but that anchor element is empty. There's nothing in between the opening and closing anchor tags. And so for all intents and purposes, that's an empty list item because again, there's nothing inside those anchor tags. So let's start coding that. So remember the unordered list itself has a class of slider nav. So that's the class we need to identify and style here. So after our nav right class, let's go ahead and skip a couple lines and create a rule for the slider nav class, which again is the class for that unordered list itself. Now I want to get rid of the bullet points, so we're going to set our list style to none, and then we want to make them visible because right now, remember, these list items don't have any content in it. So we need to set the width and height for those list items and give it a background color. So let's skip a couple lines here and point to the slider nav class space LI. So we're going to point to the list items within that slider nav. So we're going to set the background color first of all, and we're going to give it kind of a medium gray color with a value of CD, CD, CD. And then we'll set the width and height to 10 pixels each. And then again, we want to turn this into a circle. I don't want squares here. I want it to be a circle. So I'm going to round the corners by using the border radius property. And you can use any large number here. If you use just a value of 1 or 2, then it will just slightly round the corners. But if we want to round the corners so much that it turns it into a circle, we need to use a larger number. So we'll just use 10 pixels here, and that should do the trick. So let's save that, go back to our browser and refresh the page. And now we can see our 4 items here. And our bullet points are gone, but our 4 custom-made circles are now there. And it's in an unordered list, which by default has some left padding in it. So let's go into that unordered list rule, which is our slider nav class. And let's go ahead and set its padding left property to 0. So let's save that and refresh our page. And you'll see that that just pulls all of those items all the way over to the left. Now we need to position this list in the bottom left corner, but offset by about 10 pixels from the left and 10 pixels from the bottom. So let's go back to our code, and we're going to give this unordered list a position of absolute so that we can position it within that feature slider. Now remember, our feature slider up here, we've already given it a position of relative, so we're good to go there. Now we can give items inside that a position of absolute and position them within that feature slider. So again, we'll come back down to our slider nav class, which is for that unordered list. We've given it a position of absolute, and then we're going to position it 10 pixels from the bottom and 10 pixels from the left edge of that slider. So we're going to set the bottom property to 10 pixels and the left property to 10 pixels. And while we're at it, I'll go ahead and set the height to 10 pixels as well, because the bullet points within it are 10 pixels tall. And with that done, let's save again and refresh our page. And that moves our unordered list down here to the bottom. Now, we don't want this to be a vertical list. We want these to be lined up side by side, but these list items are by default block level elements. So if we want to set them side by side, we can do it a couple of ways, and I'm going to do it by using a float. So let's go back to our code, and for these list items, we want it to float to the left. So we'll set the float to left. So if we save that and refresh, we can see that they're now next to each other, but they're all still right up against each other. So I want to put some right margin on each of these list items to spread them out a little bit. So we'll come back here, and after float left, we'll set margin right to a value of 10 pixels. So we'll save that and refresh, and now they're spread out a little bit. But you'll notice that if we try to hover over these items, we're still not getting the pointer cursor. We're still just getting the default cursor. And that's because, remember, our anchor tags within these list items are still empty. There's nothing inside those anchor tags. And we're not going to change that. We're going to leave them empty, but we need to size those anchor tags appropriately so that they will actually show up here. So if we go back to our code and scroll down to the very bottom, we're going to skip a couple lines and then create a rule for the anchor tags within those list items. So we're going to point to .slider-nav space li space a. And for those anchor tags, I'm going to give them a position of absolute so that we can set the width and height for those items. And then I'm going to set the width to 10 pixels and the height to 10 pixels. And that should take care of it. So let's save our file again, refresh our browser. And now when we hover over those list items, we're now getting the pointer cursor, which means that these are now clickable links. And that's very good. So the last thing I want to do for these navigation items here is to target the active link or the active list item. The active one will represent the current slide that we're looking at. And if we look in our Photoshop file here, we can see that the active one has an orange background color. So let's go back to our code and make that happen. If we go to our index.html file, we can see that we gave that first list item a class of active, and we're going to use that class to style this. So we're going to go back to our CSS, and just after our rule for the li, or for the list items within that unordered list, we'll skip a couple lines here, point to slider-nav space li dot active, not action, active. So again, the active class is applied to the list item itself. So make sure that there's not a space between li and .active. It should just be li.active. And then inside that rule, we're just going to set our background color to that same orange value we've been using, which is F26C4E, semicolon, and that should take care of it. So let's save that, go back to our website and refresh our page, and now we can see that the item on the far left, which is the active item, has an orange background, and that's very good. Now we're not going to actually create hrefs for these links. We're going to leave that up to the developers to decide how they're going to make those links work, but we've finished the design of those links, which gets us one step closer to where we need to be. So as we move forward, we're going to finish designing this slider as we design and position the text, the button, and the image. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.